Hello folks, welcome back to the Food for Faithful channel with me, Bill Reimer, your reluctant prophet. You know, ever since Norway, particularly since I lived in Norway, I've been extremely bothered by the propensity of people around me to march in unthinking lockstep with one another. I suppose that many of my blogs and vodcasts have that theme, but it's a theme, it's a bottomless pit, isn't it? It's something one could delve into to try to understand why it is that people reject the only thing that they can be, which is namely themselves, an individual, thinking for themselves, acting for themselves, not acting out of compulsion, but acting on the basis of their own understanding, objective understanding of the world around them. So today's theme is groupthink and totalitarianism, mechanisms, manifestations, and historical comparisons. Introduction. The phenomena of groupthink and totalitarianism are deeply intertwined in the history of the 20th and 21st centuries. Groupthink, a term popularized by research psychologist Irving Janis in the 1970s, involves a psychological drive for consensus at any cost, resulting in rationalized conformity, suppression of dissenting ideas, and a collective aversion to critical evaluation. Totalitarianism, meanwhile, refers to political systems that strive for total control over all aspects of public and private life, as well as over the economy, using ideology, propaganda, terror, surveillance, and often with a single charismatic leader to enforce strict obedience and, crucially, to make groupthink the prevailing social norm. Today's blog examines how groupthink functions as a foundational psychological and socio-political mechanism within various totalitarian contexts. It delves into theoretical roots, syndromes, in operation across iconic regimes: Fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, Francoist Spain, Stalinist Soviet Union, Maoist China, post-evolutionary Iran, and military juntas, using a broad base of web sources and contemporary scholarship. Special attention is given to how groupthink enables ideological conformity, the suppression of dissent, and the durability of centralized control. My blog also contrasts groupthink with the various mechanisms of authoritarian rule, probes failures and breakdowns of groupthink within totalitarian systems, and considers the implications for contemporary societies. Next subtitle, Theoretical Foundations of Groupthink. Classic definitions and evolution. Groupthink is defined as the deterioration of mental efficiency, reality testing, and moral judgment as a result of group pressure for harmony or conformity, particularly in highly cohesive groups. Irving Janis, who conducted seminal studies on foreign policy fiascos such as the Bay of Pigs and Vietnam War escalation, outlined 8 core symptoms: illusion of invulnerability, collective rationalization, belief in inherent morality, stereotype views of outgroups, direct pressure on dissenters, self-censorship, the illusion of unanimity, and mind guards shielding the group from dissenting information. Dr. Irving Janis identified several antecedent conditions that make groupthink more likely: high group cohesiveness, isolation from outside opinions, lack of impartial or methodical decision-making procedures, homogeneity of members, backgrounds, and ideologies, strong directive or charismatic leadership, high stress from external threats or recent failures. These conditions foster an environment in which maintaining the cohesiveness of the group or regime is prioritized over rigorous evaluation of alternatives, often resulting in irrational or dangerous decisions. From psychology to political sociology is the next subtitle. While groupthink initially described small group decision-making, it scales up in the context of totalitarianism. As Hannah Arendt, Erich Fromm, and later right-wing authoritarianism theorists have noted, the suppression of dissent and deference to authority are not just traits of individual psychology, but can become the defining features of entire societies under totalitarian rule. Social psychologists Professors Duckett, Altemeyer, and Joost further emphasize the groupthink mechanisms gain particular power with in-group identification when in-group identification is threatened by perceived external enemies or internal uncertainties, increasing both authoritarian submission and aggression towards out-group enemies. Next subtitle, Mechanisms and Symptoms of Groupthink in Totalitarian Regimes. Core mechanisms. In totalitarian regimes, groupthink is actively engineered via overlapping psychological and institutional means. Suppression of dissent. Dissenters are stigmatized, silenced, or eliminated, leading to pervasive self-censorship. Internalization of ideology. The regime's narratives become internalized, making disagreement feel morally or existentially dangerous. Mind guards and informants, both formal secret police and informal peer denouncers, mechanisms ensure negative feedback is filtered out before it reaches leadership or the public. Manipulation of threat perception. Real or imagined crises are used to stoke conformity. External enemies, internal traitors, or existential threats, such as COVID, to the nation, or faith. Janus's 8 symptoms have been repeatedly observed in totalitarian context. Symptom: invulnerability. Description: excessive optimism, risky decisions. Operationalization under totalitarianism. Exaggerated confidence in military or policy plans. Symptom: rationalization, discounting warnings, justifying actions under description. How does it operate? Portrayal of purges or wars as necessary or inevitable. Symptom: morality. Description: unquestioned belief in groups or the regime's righteousness. How does it operate? Ideological campaigns, moral denunciations. Symptom: stereotypes. Description: mislabeling and othering of enemies or dissenters. How does it operate? The demonization of targeted minorities or class enemies. Symptom: pressure. Description: direct suppression of dissent. How does it operate? By punishment, show trials, and re-education campaigns. Symptom: self-censorship, individual suppression of doubts or criticisms, conformist culture and fear of reprisal. This I saw universally in Norway. It was an absolute universal reality, and it's known as Janteloven, tall poppy syndrome, and I've done many podcasts about this, so I invite you to look at them. Symptom: unanimity. Description: illusion of consensus. How does it operate? Through rituals, mass democracy, unanimous party votes. Symptom: Mind guards. Description: information filtering or protection of leader or group from dissenting input. How does it operate? Through secret police, censorship, and loyal intermediaries. Self-censorship, the illusion of unanimity, and mind guards are especially pronounced under totalitarianism, where not just formal dissent, but even private doubts become dangerous. And we see this now in Mother Country. In Great Britain, people have been jailed for thought crimes. And no, I'm not kidding. Jailed for praying not even close to, but within blocks of an abortion clinic. Silently praying, without placards. And the man was charged. Next subtitle: Groupthink and Ideological Conformity. Groupthink operates not just as a passive byproduct of totalitarianism, but as its active psychological engine. Ideological conformity is achieved when regime ideology is so pervasive that alternatives become literally unthinkable. The feedback between groupthink and totalitarianism is reciprocal. Totalitarian states breed groupthink, and groupthink enables totalitarian structures to sustain themselves. There is no such thing as an oppressive regime that doesn't have the full cooperation of its citizens, that wasn't brought into existence because of its citizens accepting the belief system of the state. Mechanisms promoting conformity. Language manipulation, or newspeak, in Orwell's 1984 is the archetype, limiting vocabulary constraints on thought, making dissent logistically impossible. This is what postmodernism is all about. It's a literary criticism of language as power. Institutional indoctrination. Education systems, youth organizations, and media enforce orthodoxy from childhood, rendering the regime's worldview unquestioned. Ritual displays and mass events, mass rallies, salutes, uniforms, and public confessions create an illusion of unanimity and reinforce conformity. That's what pride parades are about. And having men dressed as ladies, reading bedtime stories to children as though those kids aren't being groomed by them. Peer surveillance. Citizens are expected to support one another, eroding trust and enforcing self-censorship even in private spaces. Rewards and punishment. Loyalist behaviors are materially rewarded, while dissent is severely sanctioned, often by means of secret police, labor camps, or ostracism. And of course, by a social credit system. Moral reframing. Regimes present their policies as morally correct, labeling dissent as evil, treasonous, or existentially threatening. So here's a comparative table. Groupthink across totalitarian regimes. Regime, fascist Italy. Groupthink symptoms, illusion of unanimity, self-censorship, and mind guard. Mechanisms employed. Propaganda, black shirts, and OVRA. Example, suppression of opposition and public loyalty rituals. In Nazi Germany, groupthink symptoms, invulnerability, rationalization, morality, and pressure. Mechanisms employed, propaganda, the Gestapo, and a cult of personality. Examples, the Holocaust, expansionist war, and the persecution of dissenters. Regime, Francoist Spain. Symptoms, stereotyping, mass mobilization, mind guards, suppression of dissent. Mechanisms employed, national Catholicism, secret police, long-term dictatorship is an example, censorship another, repression of regional identities another example. Stalinist USSR, Groupthink symptoms: purges, pressure, mind guards, rationalization. Mechanisms employed: show trials, NKVD, purges, censorship. Examples: the gulags, famines, elimination of components, scientific stagnation. Under Maoist China, the groupthink symptoms are unanimity, self-censorship, and mass mobilization. Mechanisms employed: the Red Guards, struggle sessions, re-education. This is beginning to sound just like Canada. Example: cultural revolution, mass purges, anti-intellectual campaigns. In post-revolutionary Iran as the regime. Symptom: suppression of dissent, religious policing, moral reframing. Mechanism employed: the Revolutionary Guards, Guardian Council, theocracy. Example: suppression of minorities, ideological vetting, execution of political prisoners, and of course the mass murder of Jews. Regime: military juntas. Symptom: pressure, hierarchical obedience, control of media. Mechanism employed: martial law, censorship, and secret police. Example: human rights abuses and the silencing of civil society. In all cases, groupthink is a multi-level process. It occurs within the leadership, the party apparatus, and the academy, then downstream to society at large, reinforced by both formal institutions and social norms. The long march through the institutions, as Dr. Hans Scottmeyer once told me. Next subtitle: Groupthink in Historical Totalitarian Regimes. In Fascist Italy, under Mussolini. Mussolini's Italy offers one of the first explicit conceptualizations of totalitarian groupthink. Mussolini, once a socialist, cast fascism as a third way, focused on unity, anti-liberalism, and the myth of the leader as the embodiment of the nation. Ideological control: fascist ideology was promoted through schools, media, and meticulously orchestrated youth programs. Opera Nationale Balilla, Avanguardisti, etc., designed to instill collective loyalty and suppress independent thought. Suppression of dissent: the OVRA, secret police monitored, arrested, or exiled opponents. Opposition media was shut down. Censorship was pervasive, and even cultural activities were brought under state oversight. This is what we see in Canada, with state-funded and state-sanctioned media and alternative media being ostracized as disseminators of falsehoods. That's why Rebel has such difficulty getting into events. Cult of personality: Il Duce ha sempre ragione. The leader is always right, became a ubiquitous slogan. And by the way, I don't speak Italian, so I won't apologize for my poor pronunciation. Public rituals: mass rallies and rituals created an illusion of consent. Silence was treated as affirmation. Mind guards and violence: black shirts functioning as mind guards, violently suppressing dissenters, enforcing unity by fear and actual threat. Propaganda: the Ministry of Popular Culture centralized all messaging, glorifying both the regime and Mussolini's infallibility. Despite these efforts, counter-evidence suggests that groupthink was not total. The monarchy, church, and some social elites retained autonomy, and popular compliance sometimes reflected opportunism more than real belief, which is what I believe we see with Carney. I don't believe that he actually believes in neo-Marxism. I believe he just uses it to fatten his own wallet and as an excuse to tyrannize the rest of society. Groupthink in Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany operationalized groupthink on an unprecedented mass scale, producing not just collective obedience, but voluntary ideological alignment. Ideological indoctrination Hitler Youth and Education reoriented children to Nazi axioms. Propaganda portrayed Jews, Bolsheviks, and enemies of the Reich as an existential threat to be exterminated. Social conformity. Ordinary Germans participated in atrocities not due to compulsive terror alone, but due to genuine alignment with the regime's beliefs, a sophisticated form of groupthink in which voluntary action concealed underlying pressure and manipulated consensus. Propaganda and mass mobilization. Joseph Goebbels' propaganda machine flooded media with images of Hitler as infallible. Mass rallies invoked ecstatic group identification, making dissent not just dangerous, but socially unthinkable. Secret police as mind guards. The Gestapo, aided by informants, enforced compliance not by constant visible terror, but by making everyone fear denunciation, a form of internalized mind guarding that blurred the line between public and private introspection. In Alan Wolf's analysis of Nazi leadership during the Holocaust, groupthink was explicit. Euphemisms, secrecy, and plausible deniability were coordinated to produce consensus on policies that most would otherwise resist. Dissent, even if only in private diaries, was minimal. Doubts were suppressed, and alternative views treated as betrayal. One has to wonder if there's not a genetic component to it. Why did it take off in that part of the world so wholeheartedly? Groupthink in Francoist Spain. Francisco Franco's long dictatorship from 1939 to 1975 exemplifies groupthink both in structure and cultural effect. The ideological foundation. Franco fused militarism, Catholicism, and Spanish nationalism into a single narrative, suppressing regional identities, languages, and all political pluralism. Control through surveillance. The regime relied on secret police, single-party rule, and comprehensive censorship. Education and mandatory participation in youth organizations ensured ideological indoctrination from an early age. Unity through fear and ritual. Public life was militarized with regular parades, church rituals, and state symbolism. Expressing dissent was not only criminalized, but became socially dangerous as well. A classic groupthink effect. Suppressing dissent and reinforcing loyalty. Opposition was equated with treason. Fear of denunciation and the presence of informants led to self-censorship and the illusion of unanimity in the support of the regime. As Franco's regime aged, partial liberalizations led to cracks. Families of the regime, Falange, Carlists, Catholics, monarchists, began to diverge, and by the 1970s, the system's ideological rigidity could not prevent mounting opposition, demonstrating the limits and breakdown potential of groupthink when societal pressure shifts. Groupthink in Stalinist Soviet Union. Stalinism represents a paradigmatic instance of enforced groupthink on both elite and mass levels. Suppression of internal debate. The Communist Party purged itself, suppressing dissent through the terror of the NKVD. Nearly all competing narratives within the party and society were systematically eliminated. Collectivization and orthodoxy. From the 5-year plans to collectivization, opposing economic or scientific outlooks, example genetics versus Lysenkoism, were declared counter-revolutionary. Those who resisted were eliminated physically or professionally. Cult of personality. Stalin's image became synonymous with the party and the state. Loyalty to Stalin replaced previous communist ideals. propaganda, and censorship, socialist realism became the only permitted art. Historical revisionism erased political rivals. Diaries from the Stalin era show even private writings became a space for rehearsing regime-approved narratives and self-surveillance. This is why we see so many statues of our heroes being torn down. Mass mobilization and fear. The ever-present threat of the gulag, self-censorship, and a culture of denunciation created the ultimate mind guard system, making even skepticism a thought crime. The homogenization of thought and personal risk for dissent sustained the system for decades, but at the price of massive inefficiencies, intellectual stagnation, and increasing societal mistrust. A classic groupthink aftermath. Groupthink in Maoist China. Mao Zedong's China, especially during the Cultural Revolution, shows groupthink not just as mass coercion, but as a mass participation in ideological extremism. Campaigns of thought reform. The 100 Flowers campaign initially encouraged open criticism, only for the regime to violently suppress rightists in the subsequent anti-rightist campaign, betraying the groupthink mechanism of enticing out dissenters before eliminating them. Mass mobilization and peer policing. The Red Guards, primarily students, enforced ideological purity against intellectuals, party members, and even their own families, often violently. Public struggle sessions forced self-criticism and ritualized the confession of thought crimes, enacting groupthink's demand for unanimous affirmation. Shifting ideological ground. The abrupt transition in propaganda from long live Stalin to anti-Soviet message, or from hero worship of Lin Biao to overnight anathemization, created cognitive dissonance and undermined public trust, yet still enforced outward conformity. Cult of personality. Mao's image was omnipresent, and the little red book became the required lens through which all reality was interpreted. Thank God in my high school it was required reading. We had to study totalitarian regimes, which is one of the reasons that I have at least some sort of bedrock knowledge of where they're to head. And of course, living in Norway gave me further proof. And then when I came home in 2015, I saw this damnable enterprise manifesting itself here in Canada, and now in spades under Marxist Carney. Groupthink broke down as a cultural revolution descended into chaos, and as the regime's abrupt ideological reversals eroded public trust. Nevertheless, personal safety continued to depend on outward conformity. Groupthink in post-revolutionary Iran. The Islamic Republic of Iran, after 1979, institutionalized groupthink through religious doctrine, clerical authority, and an apparatus designed to enforce doctrinal unanimity. Ideological monopolization under Khomeini's doctrine of absolute rule of the jurist, religious and political loyalty to the supreme leader became a religious obligation. Dissent equated to both heresy and treason. Guardian council and surveillance. All candidates, journalists, and public officials are subject to ideological vetting. The Revolutionary Guards and the Basij enforce ideological conformity and suppress protest. Mass mobilization and propaganda. State-controlled media and education promote the regime's narrative, casting dissenters as traitors or agents of the West. The cult of martyrdom is employed to elicit mass rallies around the regime's legitimacy. Suppression of pluralism. Conspiracy thinking became normative. Competition is interpreted as subversion by foreign forces, and differences of opinion are summarily punished. Recent declines in public religiosity, particularly trust in the clerical establishment, along with sustained protest cycles, reveal breakdowns in group consensus and the regime's capacity for repression, yet the regime's capacity for repression remains high. Next subtitle, Groupthink and Military Juntas. Military dictatorships and juntas, example Argentina, Brazil, and Chile, adapt groupthink using official ideology, anti-communism, nationalism, and discipline. Command structure, hierarchical order takes precedence, suppressing dissent through military discipline and legal immunity. Suppressing of dissent, secret police, torture, and intimidation replace the open mass mobilization of doctrinal totalitarianism, but achieve similar ends, quelling critical thought and enforcing the illusion of national unity. Mind guards. Commanders and intelligence agencies act as the mind guards, filtering negative information and ensuring group decisions reflect the regime line, not objective analysis. And that's the key. Never are these judgments based on objective analysis. Breakdown occurs when leadership divides, talent flees, or military defeats erode the narrative of invulnerability. Propaganda, mass mobilization, and surveillance, engines of groupthink, is the next subtitle. A defining feature of totalitarian regimes and their use of propaganda, mass mobilization, and surveillance to institutionalize groupthink. Propaganda machines, regimes marshal overwhelming resources to ensure their narrative dominates. Media control, print, radio, television, and now digital platforms are coordinated to repeat official ideology, suppress negative news, and glorify the leader. And here in Canada, I can't even post a news article on Facebook. It won't accept it. This is what my government has done. Suppressing any possibility of reading alternative opinions on social media. Education as indoctrination. From children's primers to university courses, content is sanitized and tailored to promote loyalty and eliminate the possibility of alternative thinking. Pseudo-events and rituals, rallies, pride parades, and public confessions create emotional unity, reinforce the perception of unanimity, and ostracize non-participants, which is why we see even our leaders taking the knee. Mass mobilization. Population-wide participation is engineered by youth programs, Hitler Youth, Young Pioneers, Red Guards, socialized conformity, preempting the development of dissenting identities. Political organizations, one-party systems fulfill the single voice criterion, ensuring that to belong is to publicly affiliate with the regime, which is why in Canada the Liberal Party of Canada claims to be Canada's natural ruling party. Show trials and public purges. These events dramatize the fate of dissenters, serving as collecting warnings and reaffirmations of the regime's righteousness. Chris Barber and Tamara Leach are present examples of such in Canada, where we now have political prisoners. Surveillance and secret police. Surveillance. The omnipresence of state surveillance ensures that privacy ceases to be a refuge for independent thought. There's surveillance cameras everywhere, provided to us by Communist China. Imagine buying cameras whose operating systems are built by communists to police our streets. You can't make this stuff up. It's not possible. Mind guards as secret police. Regime security services, example Gestapo, NKVD, Stasi, OVRA, DINA, Revolutionary Guards, function as mind guards, quashing nascent opposition and reinforcing the group consensus by force if necessary. And I would say now, because of Tulsi Gabbard, we have evidence that both the FBI and the CIA have been involved in exactly similar things. Denunciation culture. The informant society means anyone can become a mind guard, must be a mind guard, including our neighbors and our family. We had this happen at my cousin's pool the other week. I was censored by one of my cousin's friends who told me because I expressed a sincere and demonstrably provable opinion that we weren't going to have a good afternoon because he demanded conformity of thought. The net effect is a society where open dissent disappears. Unity is performatively displayed and group consensus is manufactured by design, not by genuine dialogue. So comparative analysis of groupthink across various totalitarian systems. Regime, fascist Italy. Level of groupthink, high. Suppression of dissent, political violence and censorship. Ideological conformity based on nationalism and unity of ideals. Centralized control, high. Tools and mechanisms employed, black shirts, propaganda, OVRA. Regime, Nazi Germany. Level of groupthink, extreme. Suppression of dissent. Execution in the concentration camps. Ideological conformity. Racial. Volksgemeinschaft. Centralized control. Total! They will have total control. Tools and mechanisms, Gestapo propaganda, mass rallies, and every other German that believed the same bullshit. Regime, Franco is Spain. Level of groupthink, high. Suppression, under. Surveillance and execution. Ideological conformity based on national Catholicism. Centralized control, high. Tools and mechanisms to enforce conformity. State police, state church, and fait de l'alliance. Regime, Stalinist USSR, level of groupthink extreme. Dissent, suppression of dissent was by show trials, gulags, and purges. Ideological conformity, Marxist-Leninism, Stalinist cult, centralized control was total, and the mechanisms employed, NKVD, censorship, historical revisionism. That's why our government has to rewrite our history. Canada should be included in this list. Regime, Maoist China, level of groupthink extreme, especially during the Cultural Revolution. Suppression of dissent via public trials and re-education. Ideological conformity under Maoism and towing the party line. Centralized control was total. Mechanisms employed, the Red Guards, propaganda, and struggle sessions. The regime under which such occurred, post-revolutionary Iran, level of groupthink high. System of dissent, prison, torture, execution, vetting. Don't forget beheading. That's one of my favorites. You gotta, cut the head off that shit. Ideological conformity, Shiite Islamic ideology. This neighborhood's proof. Centralized control high. Mechanism employed to enforce. Revolutionary Guards, the Besiege, and the Guardian Council. Under military juntas, level of groupthink, moderate to high. Suppression occurs by torture, execution, and censorship. Ideological conformity was national security and hierarchy. Centralized control is authoritarian, and the mechanism employed was a command structure, martial law, and secret police. Despite ideological differences, whatever they may be, and I defy anyone to really define the difference between neo-Marxism, communism, postmodern critical theory of gender, race, and climate catastrophizing, Nazism, fascism. I defy anyone to actually describe to me what the difference between these various forms of social ideologies are, because they all demand social conformity. They're all socialized. They all have socialized medicine. They all have socialized education. They all have socialized economies under total state control. So everywhere groupthink emerges, there's a single official narrative or ideology, charismatic or absolute leadership, media and education control, surveillance and self-policing, and inducements and threat for public behaviors. Just look at how they treated the Freedom Convoy. It's unbelievable. They confiscated bank accounts. And we were coerced into receiving vaccines, so-called vaccines, that we now know have caused serious injury. Groupthink versus other control mechanisms. Well, groupthink is not the only tool for totalitarian control. It is arguably the most insidious and foundational. Other mechanisms, propaganda, censorship, surveillance, violence, can suppress dissent. But groupthink transforms these into social norms, making coercion self-sustaining. In Norway, they don't need the police to police one another, and now I see this coming here in Canada among some of my friends. I can hardly tell the truth among them without being labeled some hideous label that in no way, shape, or form actually describes why I believe what I believe, namely that every individual has the right to think for themselves, and that responsible government is necessary under constitutional restraints. Whereas external suppression relies on fear of punishment, groupthink fosters internalization of obedience and belief, such that even good faith opposition becomes psychologically or morally impossible. This internalization optimizes the efficiency of coercive tools. Propaganda is more effective when citizens are primed to accept it, and surveillance creates conformity even when not exercised overtly. Groupthink can be distinguished from outright terror. Terror crushes opposition through fear alone, while groupthink recruits the population into voluntary compliance, genuine belief, or at a minimum, complicit silence. In summation, groupthink is the medium through which all other tools become effective in the long term. Next subtitle, Failures and Breakdowns in Groupthink and Totalitarian Regimes. Despite its foundational role, groupthink invariably fails due to its injection of the nature of man, the rejection, rather, of the nature of man in favor of social engineering. Historical and contemporary evidence shows breakdown points. High-profile failures in Nazi Germany, there was overconfidence, internal suppression of dissent, and irrational consensus. The final victory delusion led to disastrous military decisions and ultimately collapse. In Stalinist USSR, suppression of scientific dissent, see Lycanism, Lysenkoism, led to agricultural failings. Mass purges eliminated capacity for self-correction. In Maoist China, the Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution exacerbated socio-economic disasters when groupthink prevented the acknowledgement of reality. Francoist Spain, eventually changing demographics, faltering economic performance, and the elite splits weakened the regime's internal consensus beyond repair, triggering the dictatorship's collapse in 1975. Common dynamics of the breakdown. Mounting social economic crisis, just like we have in Canada. This house has been for sale since April the 6th, and we've had only a handful of people come through, and I've dropped the price of the home twice. Whereas last year, these homes were selling like hotcakes. This is a manufactured economic crisis by a man, a globalist banker whose greatest victory has been fiduciary easing, to print money out of thin air And read his book, Values. You find out what his values really are. If they're not Marxist, I don't know what is. And as I said, I don't know if he really believes them. I think he's just looking for a way to game the system because he himself produces nothing. Nothing but a grievance narrative. Ever devolving grievance narrative. So mounting social economic crisis provides the material basis for the consensus collapse. The illusion of vulnerability is lost. Suppressed realities become undeniable. Elite divisions. Groupthink is vulnerable to factional splintering. Once prominent leaders break consensus, others may follow, as in Khrushchev's secret speech, Iranian revolts, and the end of apartheid in South Africa. Loss of trust. Reoccurring abrupt ideological reverses, as in Maoist China, eventually breed cynicism and withdrawal, eroding the regime's ability to maintain groupthink. External shocks, military defeat or foreign intervention can disrupt the consensus, forcing leadership to confront reality. Lessons from failure. Breakdowns of groupthink do not necessarily lead to democratization. In certain contexts, they can precipitate transition to another form of authoritarianism or chaos. However, these failures repeatedly demonstrate that robust ideological consensus enforced by groupthink is ultimately unsustainable in the face of objective contradiction and/or pluralistic social pressure. Conclusion. Groupthink as the psychological engine of totalitarianism. Across fascist, communist, theocratic, and militaristic systems, groupthink emerges as necessary, though not sufficient, condition for the sustenance of totalitarian power. It intertwines psychological tendencies, conformity, obedience, need for belonging, with institutional designs such as single-party rule, surveillance, propaganda, in order to create environments where dissent is unimaginable and reality is constructed by decree, not debate. Key takeaways. Groupthink transcends culture, ideology, and time period. Its symptoms, self-censorship, mind guard, suppression of alternatives are found wherever closed, cohesive elite or mass groups insist on unanimity, enforced by a mix of persuasion and coercion. Totalitarian regimes perfect the conditions for groupthink. Charismatic leadership, surveillance, censorship, and mass mobilization synergize to make conformity rational for survival and eventually, for many, normative. Groupthink is psychologically and politically self-reinforcing, in both cause and consequence of the suppression of dissent, ideological rigidity, and centralized control. Its limits are visible in all histories of totalitarianism. Eventually, reality punctures consensus. Dissent, however suppressed, finds covert networks, and regimes are forced to reckon with the consequences of enforced group delusions. The study of groupthink within totalitarian systems is fundamental for understanding both the extraordinary resilience and inevitable fragility of such regimes. Next to propaganda and police, groupthink remains the most powerful yet dangerous tool for the manufacture and maintenance of authoritarian control. Question. Here's my question that I had to ask myself when doing this. No matter how strong the attempts at indoctrination I have endured, I have remained immune to ideological possession and groupthink. So just why do I remain so resistant to marching in lockstep with others? Understanding the nexus of groupthink and totalitarianism remains essential, not just for historians, but for all who seek to recognize, resist, and prevent the establishment and maintenance of closed, dogmatic, and repressive systems in contemporary society. I am resistant because my mind prioritizes independence. I have never been prone to marching in lockstep with others because my cognitive wiring, psychological makeup, and life experiences all converge to favor questioning over conforming. My cognitive foundations. I have a low need for closure. It allows me to tolerate ambiguity rather than to latch onto a single narrative. Two or more things can indeed be true at the same time. Carney can be an asshole, and so can Trump at times, at least when it pertains to Canada. Trump has resurrected the Monroe Doctrine and Manifest Destiny. This cannot possibly bode well for Canada, for any who have studied our history. I'm not saying that he is bad for Americans, but he is definitely, he's the one that endorsed Carney. High metacognitive awareness means I constantly monitor and evaluate my own thought processes. One of the key features of being a Christian is knowing who the sinner is. Me. You never hear me climb up on my moral high horse. I am a wicked man, saved only by grace, and any who know me know this. I have many, many failures, but marching in lockstep ain't one of them. A strong preference for evidence-based reasoning drives me to test ideas rather than accept them at face value, which is why I taught total quality. I had to know the root cause for failures. That was my job. That's why they paid me. To find out the root causes, and assign documented corrective action. On my psychological immunity. Why? I place less value on social approval or rejecting group norms. So rejecting group norms rather carries little emotional cost for me. I literally don't give a shit. In fact, being held in contempt by some makes me horny. I actually like it. A robust sense of personal identity anchors me, making external definitions of who I am less compelling. I've likely developed emotional resilience through confronting dissonant ideas rather than by avoiding them. Environmental and experiential factors. Exposure to a broad set of perspectives through travel, reading, and relationships. There's a Norwegian saying, "En vit los man vet allt han tror, mellan fjällen och var han bor." A witness man believes everything he knows between the two mountains where he lives. I've gotten out of my little comfort zone and gone elsewhere to find how other societies live. And it's always a paradigm challenger for those that dare do such things. I didn't seek to understand those societies through my lens. I sought to understand the society through the lens of the people living there. Formative experience with the negative outcomes of conformity, whether that's academic, professional, or personal, reinforces my autonomy. Solitary pursuits like writing, research, creative projects, and indeed recording these vodcasts strengthen my internal voice above the crowd's obscene call for blind obedience. Neurobiological underpinnings. Some research links my tolerance for uncertainty to specific dopamine receptor profiles, which have likely made me more willing and more open to conflicting viewpoints. My prefrontal cortex activity associated with analytical thinking may be more pronounced, helping me to override default social conformity impulses. And the final and most important, the God underpinning of my psyche, my soul, and my spiritual nature. From Galatians 5:1, King James Version, I choose to stand fast, therefore, in the liberty wherewith Christ has made us free, and not be entangled again with the yoke of bondage. John, the Gospel of John, chapter 8, verse 32, again King James Version, and you shall know the truth, The truth shall make you free. My final thought. The West has succumbed to ideological possession as a direct result of the rejection of Christ the King. Repent and turn to Christ, lest another totalitarian disaster take over the West. Because this time, the tyranny is about to express itself on a global scale. These are things to think and pray about on the afternoon of August the 20th, 2025. God bless you all.